Le Pen says she will run for presidency after court lifts ban. The consensus read is already outdated. What matters now is the second-order effect most commentary still ignores. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. 3 months ago, a French court handed down a 5-year ban on her running for office. It seemed final. It seemed like the end of her path to the presidency. But last week, an appeals court lifted that ban entirely. Now she's announcing she will run in 2027. This matters far more than a single candidate comeback. Let's be clear about what actually happened here. Le Pen was convicted in 2023 for misusing European Parliament funds, a financial scandal tied to her National Rally party. The initial verdict included a ban from holding elected office. This wasn't political theatre. This was a court saying, you broke the law, and you can't run. But French appeals courts move slowly, and the legal system has layers. The appeals process dragged on for months. And then, in the last few weeks, the court essentially said the ban was disproportionate. They lifted it. Why does this matter? France's next presidential election is in 2027. Le Pen has spent the last decade building the National Rally from a fringe movement into a genuine political force. In the 2022 election, she made it to the runoff against Macron and lost with 41% of the vote. That's not a fringe result. That's a mainstream political presence. Without the ban, she becomes the frontrunner for 2027. With the ban lifted, she's now announcing her candidacy immediately. The momentum signal is clear, the far right in France believes it can win. Now here's the part most people are missing. This doesn't just affect France. The European far right has been on an upswing for years. Look at Italy, Giorgia Meloni is already Prime Minister. Look at Hungary, Viktor Orban has consolidated power. Look at the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom is now the biggest political force after the latest election. Le Pen's comeback fits a pattern. It's not an outlier. It's the continuation of a trend that's remaking European politics. For investors, this creates a new tail risk. France is the second largest economy in the European Union. If Le Pen wins in 2027, her stated positions include a harder line on immigration, skepticism toward NATO, and a more nationalist economic approach. She's talked about pulling France out of EU-level decisions on military and fiscal policy. The euro would be under pressure. European bond spreads would widen. This is the kind of political shock that moves markets. It's not the most likely outcome, but it's no longer a 1% tail risk. It's a 10 to 15% possibility depending on how Macron's government performs over the next 2 years. For European regulators and policymakers, the signal is even more stark. The lift of Le Pen's ban suggests that French courts believe the initial penalty was too harsh. It opens the door for other political figures facing similar convictions to argue they should be able to run. The legal framework around disqualifying candidates just became less stable. And crucially, it shows that if you're a far-right party with strong public support, the courts may ultimately protect your right to participate in elections. Democratic institutions are holding, but they're being tested. Here's what changes next. Over the next 6 months, watch 3 things. First, Le Pen will rebuild her campaign infrastructure. She'll announce key advisors and policy positions. Every move will be scrutinized for whether she's moderating her image or leaning further right. Second, Macron's approval rating and legislative momentum will matter enormously. If the French government remains unpopular, Le Pen's path to the runoff becomes clearer. If Macron recovers, 2027 becomes a 3-way race. Third, watch the European Union's response. If Le Pen becomes a serious contender for French presidency, EU leaders will start hedging their bets. Some will move closer to her to maintain influence. Others will push back harder. The calculus of European politics just shifted. The deeper insight here is about the durability of democratic safeguards when they face real political pressure. France's courts were supposed to prevent Le Pen from running. They decided that preventing her was a greater violation of democratic principles than allowing her to run. You can argue that's the right call. You can also argue it's the moment the legal system blinked under pressure. Either way, the precedent is set. And for everyone watching European politics, investors, policymakers, citizens, this is a signal to start planning for scenarios that seemed unlikely 6 months ago. This is worth paying close attention to. The implications for European stability, NATO cohesion, and market volatility over the next 18 months are significant. Follow the story at Atlas Signal. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.